December 19th, 1944, 11:47 a.m. Stalag III B prisoner of war camp, Fürstenberg, Germany. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann, 24 years old, sat in the frozen mud of the compound, holding an American K-ration box he'd traded 3 cigarettes for. His hands shook, not from cold but from what he was reading on the waxed cardboard. Net weight, 32 ounces. Caloric content, approximately 3.0 calories for 1 day's ration. His own daily ration from the Wehrmacht, 843 calories, on good days. Before we continue with Klaus Zimmermann's story, we need your help to keep these forgotten perspectives alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Stalag III B, where Klaus Zimmermann was about to understand why Germany was losing the war. Klaus turned the box over in his calloused fingers. Inside this single meal pack, canned meat, biscuits, candy, cigarettes, toilet paper, matches and chewing gum. The meat tin alone, pork and beans, contained more protein than he'd seen in a week. The chocolate bar, a luxury he hadn't tasted since 1942. But it wasn't the food itself that made his stomach clench. It was the casual abundance, the throwaway excess. The Americans gave this to every single soldier, every day, in every theater of war. The box was designed to be discarded after one use. Klaus had been eating sawdust bread and turnip soup for 8 months. Klaus Zimmermann grew up in Lübeck, a port city on the Baltic Sea, where his father worked as a commercial fisherman. At 5'8" and 142 pounds when conscripted in 1941, Klaus was considered fit for service, barely. He'd grown up hungry during the Depression years, like most German boys born in 1920. The Nazi promise of bread and work had resonated in households like his, where dinner was often potatoes and more potatoes. When Klaus turned 18 in 1938, he joined the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service like all German youth. 6 months of digging ditches and building autobahns on 500 calories per day. It felt like plenty at the time. He remembered thinking the portions were generous, that the new Germany was keeping its promise. In March 1941, Klaus was drafted into the Wehrmacht's 12th Infantry Division. Basic training at Döberitz lasted 12 weeks. The food improved, 3.77 calories daily for active recruits, real meat twice a week, butter, white bread, coffee with real sugar. Klaus gained 15 pounds. He wrote home to his mother, "They feed us like we're going to build a new Europe with our bare hands." He had no idea how right he was, or how temporary the feeding would be. By June 1941, Klaus was in Poland, preparing for Operation Barbarossa. His unit crossed into Soviet territory on June 22nd, part of the largest invasion force in human history. 3 million German soldiers, 600 tanks, 700 aircraft. Klaus carried 65 pounds of equipment, a Karabiner 98K rifle, and 3 days of rations in his pack. Those 3 days lasted 5. The official daily ration for frontline Wehrmacht soldiers in 1941 was 3.077 calories, 750 grams of bread, 136 grams of meat, 25 grams of fat, 15 grams of sugar. On paper, it seemed adequate. In practice, supply lines couldn't keep up with the advance. By August, Klaus was eating 200 calories on a good day. By September, 900. By the time snow fell in October, sometimes as little as 400. Klaus's best friend, Feldwebel Ernst Bruckner from Nuremberg, started joking about the rations that November. Ernst was 23, a baker's son who'd enlisted with Klaus in the same recruitment wave. They'd promised each other they'd open a bakery together after the war, Zimmermann and Bruckner, right on the Lübeck waterfront. Ernst would handle the baking, Klaus would manage the books. They shook hands on it the night before they crossed the Bug River. Ernst stopped joking about the food in December 1941. That's when the bread ration dropped to 500 grams. That's when the meat became mostly horse. That's when they started boiling leather boots to make soup. On January 8, 1942, near Gève, Ernst Bruckner collapsed during a march. Temperature -31 degrees Celsius. He'd given half his bread ration to a younger soldier for 3 days straight. Klaus found him face down in the snow, 50 meters behind the column. Ernst's last words, "Tell my father I'm sorry about the bakery." He was dead before the medics arrived. Cause of death on the official report, exhaustion and exposure. Real cause, starvation. Ernst weighed 98 pounds. He'd been 168 pounds at induction. Klaus carried Ernst's Soldbuch, his paybook, for the rest of the war. Inside the front cover, Ernst had written, "Zimmermann and Bruckner, opening day May 1946. Between January 1942 and December 1943, the average Wehrmacht soldier on the Eastern Front lost 17 to 23 pounds. In Klaus's regiment, the 5th Company, 2nd Battalion, malnutrition-related illnesses caused more casualties than enemy fire in 47 separate weeks. Dysentery, scurvy, trench foot, frostbite, exacerbated by poor nutrition. The pattern was always the same. Rations would arrive irregular, incomplete, spoiled. A shipment of bread infested with weevils, meat tins frozen solid, impossible to open, butter rancid, sugar diluted with sawdust, coffee that was 70% chicory and grain. Klaus watched men die the same way Ernst had, slowly then suddenly. Private Werner Holtz, 19, from Dresden, collapsed during a reconnaissance patrol in March 1942, dead within 6 hours. Obergefreiter Stefan Köhler, 26, from Hamburg, developed scurvy in May 1942. Lost all his teeth, bled internally, died in a field hospital. Gefreiter Hans Vogel, 21, from Munich, shot through the shoulder in July 1942, a survivable wound, died from infection 3 weeks later because his body couldn't fight it. The doctors said he didn't have enough protein in his system to heal. 12 men from Klaus's company died this way between January and August 1942. All the same pattern, all preventable. The officers knew, the logistics corps knew. But the Wehrmacht was fighting a war on a front spanning 1,800 miles, and the German rail system couldn't supply 3 million men adequately, especially after the Soviets started destroying every rail line, every bridge, every depot in their retreat. By late 1942, Klaus noticed something the officers weren't saying. Soviet prisoners looked better fed than German soldiers. Not well fed. Nobody on the Eastern Front was well fed, but less skeletal. The Russians had figured out something the Germans hadn't: how to keep men fighting on minimal calories. Black bread that was mostly sawdust and potato peels, but it filled the stomach. Kasha, buckwheat groats that provided just enough energy. The Soviets weren't eating well, but they were eating consistently. The Germans were eating sporadically and hoping for the best. Klaus was captured on July 4, 1943, during the Battle of Kursk. His unit, what remained of it, was surrounded by Soviet armor near Prokhorovka. Of the 180 men in his company, 34 survived to surrender. Klaus weighed 127 pounds, down from 157 at the start of the Russian campaign. The Soviets marched them 40 kilometers to a temporary holding camp. No food for 3 days. Klaus expected to die. Instead, on the 4th day, they received soup, cabbage, potatoes, and something that might have been fish. Maybe 400 calories. But it was hot. It was real. And it came again the next day and the next. For 6 months, Klaus was held in Soviet camps. The rations were terrible. 800 to 100 calories per day, but they were reliable. Every day, twice a day, the same thin soup and hard bread. Klaus stopped losing weight. His mind cleared. The constant hunger faded to a dull background ache instead of a screaming panic. In January 1944, Klaus and 200 other German POWs were transferred to American custody as part of a prisoner exchange agreement. They were loaded onto trucks. American trucks, Klaus noted, newer and better maintained than anything he'd seen in the Wehrmacht, and driven to a transfer camp in Poland. That's when Klaus got his first look at American logistics. The camp was temporary, just a staging area, but it was stocked like a permanent depot. Row after row of supply tents, stacks of wooden crates stamped U.S. Army, mountains of material, clothing, blankets, medical supplies, ammunition, and food. So much food. The American guards were polite, almost friendly. They processed the German prisoners efficiently, medical checks, delousing, new clothing. Klaus received a full uniform, American-made, sturdy cotton, no holes, and a blanket that wasn't infested with lice. Then came dinner. Klaus and the other prisoners were led to a mess tent. The smell hit him first. Real meat cooking. Not horse, not mystery tins, but actual beef. His mouth watered so intensely it hurt. Each prisoner received a metal tray. The American cooks, black soldiers, Klaus noted with surprise, moved down the line, serving portions with mechanical efficiency. Klaus stared at his tray. Roast beef. Mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, white bread with butter, coffee with sugar and condensed milk, a piece of apple pie. He didn't move. He couldn't process what he was seeing. The man next to him, Gefreiter Paul Richter from Berlin, whispered, "Is this real?" Klaus picked up his fork. The beef was tender, properly cooked, seasoned. The potatoes were creamy, rich with butter. The bread was soft, fresh, probably baked that morning. The pie was sweet enough to make his teeth ache. He ate slowly, afraid it was a dream. Afraid he'd wake up back in the Rzhev snow eating boot leather soup. It wasn't a dream. This was the standard meal for American POWs, every day, 3 times a day. Over the following weeks at Stalag the 3B, Klaus became obsessed with understanding American supply logistics, not as an intelligence effort, the war was clearly lost by this point, but as an intellectual puzzle. How did they do it? He started collecting evidence. Other prisoners traded with American guards for cigarettes, candy, newspapers. Klaus traded for something different. Empty ration boxes, supply manifests, anything with numbers. The K ration box was his first breakthrough. Developed in 1942, designed by physiologist Ansel Keys, intended for paratroopers and mobile troops who couldn't access field kitchens. 3 boxes per day, breakfast, dinner, supper, providing 2 8:30 to 3, 00 calories. But the K ration wasn't even the standard. It was the reduced ration, the emergency ration. The standard American Army ration, the A ration served at field kitchens, provided 4 200 calories per day, 4,200. Klaus read the number 3 times to make sure he wasn't mistaken. That was more than twice what Wehrmacht frontline troops received in 1944. It was nearly 3 times what German POWs received. It was more calories than Klaus had consumed in any single day since 1941. Klaus began documenting everything he learned. He kept notes in the margins of Ernst's Soldbuch, the only paper he owned. The notes became a catalogue of American excess that bordered on the absurd. American A ration, standard daily allowance. 20 ounces of meat, 22 ounces of bread, 18 ounces of potatoes, fresh vegetables, butter, sugar, coffee, milk, dessert. Total 4, 200 calories Wehrmacht ration, official rarely achieved by 1944. 26, 4 ounces of bread, 4, 8 ounces of meat, minimal fat, sugar, coffee. Total 1, 843 calories, often less. The Americans were feeding their soldiers more than double, every single day, in every theater of operations. In Europe, the Pacific, Africa, everywhere. But Klaus discovered something even more staggering. The American supply chain could deliver this consistently. He learned this from an unlikely source, an American supply sergeant named Frank Morrison, 28, from Indianapolis. Morrison was part of the guard rotation at Stalag the 3B, and he liked to practice his German with the prisoners. Klaus helped him with verb conjugations. Morrison shared stories about his job in the Quartermaster Corps. One evening in February 1945, Morrison explained the American logistics system to Klaus. They sat in the guard shack, Morrison smoking a Lucky Strike, Klaus nursing a cup of real coffee Morrison had given him. "See, Klaus, the thing you got to understand is that America isn't fighting this war like you guys. We're not trying to conquer and hold territory. We're trying to bury you under so much stuff that you can't move." Morrison pulled out a small notebook. "I'm a supply sergeant, right? My job is to make sure every man in my unit gets his full ration, every day, no exceptions. You know how we do that." Klaus shook his head. "Redundancy. We overstock everything by 40%. Every supply depot, every forward base, every ship. If we need one Sayosu 0K rations, we order 1-400. If we need 10 trucks, we requisition 14. We waste on purpose because it's cheaper than running out." Klaus's mind reeled. "You waste on purpose?" "Sure. Look, say a supply convoy gets hit, loses 20% of its cargo. In your army, that's a disaster, right? Men go hungry, operations get delayed, everything goes to hell. In our army?" We just shrug. "We planned for it. The redundancy means we still have enough." Morrison leaned back, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "My unit uses about 300K rations per week. You know how many we have in our depot right now? 100. That's 7 weeks' worth, just sitting there. And next week another shipment comes in, whether we need it or not." Klaus did the math in his head. 7 weeks of buffer stock. The Wehrmacht rarely had 7 days. "But how—" Klaus struggled to find the words. "How do you transport all this? The ships, the trucks, the fuel?" Morrison grinned. "That's the beautiful part. America makes 60% of the world's oil. We've got more trucks than your entire army has vehicles. And we're building more every day. Ford's cranking out a new truck every 3 minutes. Literally. 1 truck, 3 minutes, 24 hours a day." He stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. "You know what your biggest mistake was? You thought you could win a war with strategy and tactics. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, all that. But modern war isn't about strategy. It's about logistics. It's about which side can put more men in the field with more food, more bullets, more everything. And, Klaus, we can bury you in canned peaches if we want to." Klaus sat silent, processing this. Every number Morrison mentioned was staggering, but what shocked him more was the casual way Morrison discussed it. This wasn't German efficiency, precise, calculated, optimized. This was American abundance, messy, wasteful, overwhelming. Morrison noticed Klaus's expression. "You're thinking we're wasteful, aren't you?" "Yes, we are totally wasteful, but here's the thing, we can afford to be. Your country's been on ration cards since before the war. Our guys back home are eating better than they ever did during the Depression. We've got so much food that we're literally throwing it away. We feed it to pigs. We let it rot. And we're still shipping millions of tons overseas to feed our troops and half of Europe's refugees." Klaus thought of Ernst, dead in the snow, having given away his bread. He thought of Werner and Stefan and Hans, all dead because their bodies couldn't fight wounds and disease on 1-400 calories per day. He thought of the 12 men from his company who'd starved while Germany's leadership promised final victory. "We lost the war," Klaus said quietly, "because we couldn't feed our soldiers." Morrison nodded. "Among other reasons, yeah. You can have the best soldiers, the best tanks, the best strategy. But if your men are starving, none of it matters. War is math, Klaus. Calories, bullets, fuel, production capacity. We've got more of all of it, a lot more." Klaus wasn't the only prisoner making these calculations. Word spread through Stalag the 3B like wildfire. German POWs began trading for American rations just to examine them, to hold physical proof of the disparity. Hauptmann Captain Friedrich Weber, a logistics officer captured in France, started keeping detailed records. Weber had spent 2 years managing supply lines for the 7th Army. He understood Wehrmacht logistics intimately, all its failures, all its systematic inadequacies. Weber obtained sample American rations, K rations, C rations, D ration chocolate bars, 10-in-1 ration kits. He weighed them, calculated their caloric content, documented every item. In March 1945, Weber gave an unofficial lecture in one of the barracks. 70 German prisoners attended, including Klaus. Weber had created charts using scraps of paper and charcoal, hanging them on the wall like a university professor. "Gentlemen," Weber began, "I want to show you why we lost this war, not tactics, not strategy, mathematics." He pointed to his first chart. The average German soldier in 1944 receives 1,843 calories per day, sometimes less, often much less. The Wehrmacht's official ration contains adequate protein and vitamins, but only if delivered in full, which it rarely is. Weber moved to the second chart. The average American soldier receives 200 calories per day through the A ration. If field kitchens are unavailable, he receives K rations or C rations providing 300 calories minimum. The Americans have never, I repeat never, failed to deliver full rations to their combat troops in any theater of this war. A murmur went through the crowd. Weber continued. Let's examine what this means in practical terms. A soldier requires approximately 300 calories per day to maintain body weight and combat effectiveness during active operations. Below 500 calories, the body begins catabolizing muscle tissue. Below 200 calories, cognitive function declines significantly. Below 500 calories, the soldier becomes combat ineffective within weeks. He let that sink in. The Wehrmacht has been operating below the threshold of combat effectiveness since 1942. We have been asking our soldiers to fight while their bodies consume themselves. Klaus felt sick. He'd known this intuitively, had lived it, but hearing it stated so clinically made it undeniable. Weber pointed to his third chart. Now let's discuss logistics capacity. The United States produced 5 million trucks between 1941 and 1945. Germany produced 345,000. The Americans built 257,000 aircraft. We built 119,000. The Americans produced 88,000 tanks. We produced 67,000. But most crucially, the Americans produced 650 million tons of steel during the war. Germany produced 230 million. The Soviet Union produced 150 million. Combined, the Allies outproduced the Axis by a factor of 4-1. Weber stepped back from his charts. Gentlemen, we were mathematically doomed from the start. This war was not lost in 1945 or even 1944. It was lost in 1941 when we invaded the Soviet Union without the industrial capacity to sustain a two-front war. Every subsequent battle was merely delaying the inevitable. One of the prisoners, a young Unteroffizier corporal, raised his hand. Sir, with respect, we had superior tactics, superior training. Man for man, we were better soldiers. Weber nodded. Absolutely true. German tactical doctrine was superior. German soldiers were better trained. On a tactical level, we won the majority of engagements, but strategy without logistics is fantasy. You cannot eat superior training. You cannot fuel tanks with tactical brilliance. He held up a K-ration box. This represents more than food. It represents industrial capacity, transportation infrastructure, resource abundance, global trade networks, financial depth. The Americans can produce, package, and deliver this to every soldier in every theater, because they have the industry to manufacture the boxes, the farms to grow the food, the trucks to transport it, the ships to deliver it, the oil to fuel everything, and the money to pay for all of it. Weber set the box down. We had courage and discipline. They had calories and capacity. In modern warfare, capacity wins. Every time. The room fell silent. Klaus looked around and saw the same realization on every face. The war hadn't been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in factories and farms and supply depots. It had been lost in production spreadsheets and cargo manifests. Germany had sent starving men to fight well-fed enemies and expected valor to compensate for malnutrition. It couldn't. It never could. Klaus kept collecting data throughout the spring of 1945. It became an obsession, a way to make sense of Ernst's death and all the others. He learned that American soldiers received regular vitamin supplements, that field hospitals had blood plasma, penicillin, and morphine in abundance, that frontline units had portable stoves, insulated clothing, and winterized vehicles. He learned that American tank crews carried 2 days' worth of rations in their tanks, plus chocolate bars and cigarettes, that American paratroopers jumped with so much food that they often discarded excess supplies, that American bomber crews received steak and eggs before missions because the military believed well-fed crews performed better. Most devastatingly, Klaus learned about American attitudes toward their rations. Morrison showed him complaint letters, actual letters from American soldiers complaining about K rations being boring. Boring, not insufficient, not spoiled, not infested with weevils. Boring. My guys gripe constantly, Morrison said with a laugh. The meat's too salty. The coffee's not hot enough. They want fresh eggs instead of powdered. Can you believe it? Klaus couldn't. He remembered eating frozen horse meat and considering himself lucky. Morrison continued. Command takes the complaints seriously too. That's why we developed the 10-in-1 rations. More variety, better taste. And the new B ration, which is almost restaurant quality. We're constantly improving because soldier morale depends partly on food quality. Quality. The Americans were concerned about the quality of rations that would have been considered luxurious by Wehrmacht standards. Klaus documented one particularly striking comparison. Contents of one American K ration, breakfast. Canned chopped ham and eggs, 2 ounces. 4 crackers, 1 bar of candy. 1 packet of instant coffee. 3 sugar tablets, 4 cigarettes, chewing gum, toilet paper, matches, can opener, water purification tablets, contents of 1 Wehrmacht iron ration, emergency only. 250 grams Dauerbrot, hard bread. 200 grams canned meat. 150 grams dried vegetables, 25 grams coffee, 25 grams salt. The German iron ration was only to be consumed on direct orders and had to be replaced immediately. The American K ration was distributed casually, daily in quantities so large that soldiers traded them for non-essentials. The psychological impact was profound. Klaus started interviewing other prisoners, asking the same question. When did you realize we'd lost? Most answers were similar. Obergefreiter Martin Fischer. When I saw American supply columns, just truck after truck after truck stretching to the horizon. New trucks perfectly maintained. We were moving supplies with horses and wagons like it was 1914. Feldwebel Otto Braun. When I was wounded in France, the American medics had morphine, bandages, plasma, antibiotics. Our medics had cloth strips and hope. I watched an American with the same wound as me get treated properly and survive, while Germans with lighter wounds died from infection. Gefreiter Ludwig Stein. When I captured an American position in the Ardennes, we were starving, exhausted. We found their mess tent, hot food just sitting there, gallons of it, coffee in urns, fresh bread, meat, fruit cocktail in cans. We stopped fighting and just ate. The Americans counterattacked 3 hours later and caught us in their own mess tent, too full to move. Every story followed the same pattern. The moment of realization that Germany wasn't losing battles. Germany was being outproduced, outsupplied, and outfed. Klaus wrote in Ernst's Soldbuch, "We sent hungry men to fight an enemy that worried about food being boring. We never had a chance." On April 25, 1945, Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe River. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Klaus heard the news in the prison yard. He felt nothing. Relief, maybe. The war was over. He'd survived. But then Hauptmann Weber found him. Weber was holding a clipboard, his face pale. "Zimmermann, I need to show you something." Weber had obtained final statistics from a sympathetic American officer, numbers from the entire war, now compiled and analyzed. Wehrmacht casualties from combat. 2,303,000 Wehrmacht casualties from non-combat causes, disease, malnutrition, exposure. 1,230, Yosil. More than 1 million German soldiers, men like Ernst, Werner, Stefan and Hans, had died not from enemy action, but from the Wehrmacht's inability to keep them healthy and fed. Weber showed Klaus another number, American combat deaths in Europe, 185,000. American deaths from disease and malnutrition, 3,800, out of millions deployed. The Americans had lost more men to traffic accidents than to starvation and disease. "Do you understand now?" Weber asked quietly. "This was never a military contest. It was an industrial competition, and we brought a sword to a factory." Klaus returned to Lübeck in December 1945. The city was rubble. The harbor was filled with scuttled ships. His father's fishing boat was gone, probably sunk or stolen. His childhood home was a pile of bricks. He weighed 134 pounds, still 23 pounds below his induction weight. For 3 months, Klaus lived in a displaced persons camp, eating donated American rations. the same K rations and C rations he'd studied as a prisoner. The irony wasn't lost on him. Germany was now being fed by the army it had fought. In March 1946, Klaus found work as a carpenter, helping rebuild Hamburg. The pay was minimal, but it included 1 meal per day, provided by the Allied Occupation Authority. More American rations. Klaus never stopped calculating calories. For the rest of his life, he'd mentally note the caloric content of every meal. He'd remember the taste of sawdust bread and horsemeat soup. He'd remember Ernst's last words about the bakery. Klaus never opened a bakery. He remained a carpenter, eventually becoming a foreman. He married in 1951, had 3 children, lived quietly in a rebuilt Lübeck. He never talked about the war. When his children asked, he'd say simply, "I was there. I survived. That's enough." But he kept Ernst's Soldbuch until his death, the margins filled with his notes about American logistics. Numbers, calculations, comparisons, evidence of the mathematical certainty of Germany's defeat. In 1983, an American military historian named Dr. Robert Patterson was researching Wehrmacht logistics for a book on supply chain management in World War II. He was interviewing German veterans through a Veterans Association program. Someone mentioned Klaus Zimmermann, a former Obergefreiter who'd become obsessed with American rations while a POW. Patterson traveled to Lübeck to interview Klaus. He was 63, still working part-time as a carpenter, still thin despite decades of adequate nutrition. Klaus showed Patterson the Soldbuch. The historian immediately recognized its value, a primary source document showing a German soldier's real-time analysis of Allied logistics superiority. "Mr. Zimmermann," Patterson said through a translator, "these notes are extraordinary. Would you be willing to have them published?" Klaus shook his head. "What's the point? The war is over. We lost. Everyone knows why." "Do they?" Patterson asked. "Most people think Germany lost because of Hitler's decisions, or Soviet numbers, or American technology. Very few understand that you lost because your soldiers were starving while ours were complaining about boring food. Your perspective, a logistics officer captured at Kursk analyzing American supply methods in real time, that's historically invaluable." Klaus considered this. "Will it help anyone?" "It might help people understand that wars aren't just won by brave soldiers. They're won by farmers and factory workers and truck drivers, by the people who feed and supply the soldiers." Klaus agreed. Patterson published excerpts of the Soldbuch notes in his 1985 book, Logistics and the German Defeat. The book became a standard text at the U.S. Army War College. Klaus Zimmermann died on November 3, 1998, at age 78. The obituary in the Lübecker Nachrichten mentioned his military service in one sentence. Zimmermann served in the Wehrmacht during World War II. Nothing about his analysis. Nothing about Ernst. Nothing about the 12 men who starved while their country promised victory. There's a small display at the German Military History Museum in Dresden. Case 17B, second floor, Eastern Front exhibition. Inside, an American K ration box, a Wehrmacht iron ration tin, and a worn Soldbuch with notes in the margins. A small placard reads, "The logistics gap between Allied and Axis forces contributed significantly to Germany's defeat." German soldiers often operated on less than half the caloric intake of their Allied counterparts. Most visitors walk past without stopping. The display isn't dramatic. No weapons, no uniforms, no battle flags, just food boxes and a small notebook. But if you stop and read Klaus's notes in the margins, you'll see the moment a soldier understood the truth. Wars are won by the side that can keep its soldiers fed, equipped and fighting. Everything else is just tactics. Ernst Bruckner's bakery never opened. Klaus never forgot him. If this story showed you a perspective on World War II you'd never considered, that wars are won in factories and farms before they're won on battlefields, please hit the like button. It helps YouTube share these forgotten stories with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage, innovation, and the brutal mathematics of war. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? What did your family experience during World War II? Do you have relatives who served? We want to hear your stories and honor your family's memory. Thank you for spending time with Klaus and Ernst and all the men who fought while hungry. They deserve to be remembered.